Welcome to a tutorial video on Twine 2.1. In this video I'm going to cover using CSS for icons and different ways of using those icons with existing macros in Twine 2.1. So look at the story here. A quick way to use icons in your Twine story is through Cascading style sheets, CSS. There are several open versions of this. Google has one, there are a number of other ones, however they're not always free, so be careful if you'd like to use them, that you're aware if you plan on selling your story or posting your story in certain places that you're not infringing other people's copyright. So for this example though, I'm going to use one hosted with Google, which I'll show how to do when we get back to the source. But through using an icon, which is actually a font set, we can have the icons appear in the place of words, and through using only CSS. So for example, here are 5 icons. We have a cloud and a heart and a paperclip and what looks like a computer and a street light. So we have 5 icons, and notice how I can highlight them so they exist as part of a font, just like I can highlight other words. What if we wanted to change things though? So because these icons are actually part of a font set, they react to changing the font size with a hyphen in CSS. In this new example, I've added a font size 48 pixel style rule to them, and it's made them bigger. So if we wanted to make them bigger or smaller, and see I can still highlight them, we can do so by changing their CSS rules, changing the font size specifically, to make it bigger or smaller depending on whatever pixel size or other units we want to use. But what if we wanted to align them in different ways? So in addition to using the icons in the 2 different ways I've shown here, we can make them bigger or smaller by adjusting the font size. We also include them, as I'll show when we get back to the source. We can also align them using the bar and equal signs and the markdown as part of Harlowe. Now before I go too far, I really want to recommend going and looking at the documentation, as I'll remind when we get back to the source as well. Done a really great job of documenting how all of these things work in Harlowe, and I always recommend people go check it out so I can show you examples. But if you want to look at the full source and how all of the examples in different ways work together, I really recommend going and check out the documentation. So each bar is a column length, and each equal sign is a letter, M margin space. Basically the size of a W in whatever font you're using, most of the time anyway, depending on the font choice. But we can align them using the bar and the equal sign, which will make a little more sense when we go look at the code. But as we can see at the top here, we can align them in columns. So we can make them look like they're icons on the desktop in a similar way. So we can import the icons, as I'll show when we go look at the source. We can make them bigger or smaller using different font rules, changing the CSS. And we can also align them in this way using the bar and equal signs to space them equally in columns so they kind of look like desktop icons. But what if we wanted functionality to add to that? So we can make them act like desktop icons in a similar way. So borrowing from a previous video on using modals, we can use the icons to create a click for new window type of effect. So when we click on the icon, it opens a modal window, shows us some information. We can close that window, and then we can reopen it by clicking on the icon in the same way. And it acts similar to and mimics sort of the desktop icon setup in a similar way here. So notice we have cloud, and when I put my cursor over it, it switches to a pointer, as well as shows that it's a link, it changes color. When I click on it, we have a modal, some content in the cloud, as well as what was shown in the previous video. Using this modal, we can't access anything else until we close it. And we sort of have a mimicry now of a desktop icon. So we can import them, we can change their size, we can align them, as well as we can use them with different functionality to mimic the act of clicking on an icon in a desktop environment. So let's go look at the code for a moment. So as you can see, actually using these icons is very straightforward. There are a number of different tutorials out there. The W3C School is a pretty good one. And if you Google CSS icon set or CSS icon set tutorials, there are a number of different tutorials out there to show you how to do this if you want to review. I've just used 5 icons here as a test. So we see material icons, which matches the set I'm using, which we'll go visit in just a moment, as well as the word, the cloud, favorite, attachment, computer, traffic. So we have here the words being replaced with the icons themselves due to the use of importing them in the CSS, which I'll visit here in just a moment. But as you can see, their usage is very straightforward. We have an I, and we have the class, so material icons, and then what it is, a cloud, favorite, attachment, whatever. So let's go look at that CSS for a moment. So to change the cascading style sheets of a story, we click on its name, and then we click on Edit Story Style Sheet. And as you can see here, this very first line is doing most of the work for us here. So I'm using the import, the URL, and then its source, in this case fonts, hosted by Google, using an icon family of material icons. And of course, as I mentioned, there are a number of different tutorials out there that can walk you through using this, as well as point you at other free sources if you care to use them. So we have import, the URL, like I said, and then its source. And so this is doing the major work for us within this first passage. So we import that font set, which is an icon set, and it allows us to change these words using this class into the icons themselves, the cloud, the heart, the paperclip, the computer, and the traffic signal. We want to change them, as we saw in the second passage, bigger. I did an additional style rule, as I talked about here, font size 48 pixels. To do that, I just added another class. Notice it's a space and not a comma. So material icons, which already exist, and then bigger, which adds an additional CSS rule. So let's go back and look at that. Again, click on the name, Edit Story Style Sheet, and we see bigger just has that additional rule. We change the font size to 48 pixels. And we can add that as an additional class to an HTML element. So class equals material icons and then bigger. And all bigger is, like I showed, is font size 48 pixels. So if we want, we can adjust them up and down, like I said, by just adding an additional class and then tweaking it from there. Now there was one extra thing in there that I haven't gone over yet. So go back to Edit, which icon hover. Now as I'm about to show, when we move into the next one here, we can see how icon hover changes the cursor to a pointer. So it shows something you can click on. Before we can do that though, let's review aligning. So as I mentioned when we first went through the story, there are different ways of doing alignment using the equal sign and the bar. And of course, I highly recommend going and checking out the documentation to review how all of this works in different practices. However, to left align something, it's the bar and then the equal sign. To middle align it in a way, it's an equal sign, a bar, and an equal sign. And sort of to right align it is an equal sign and a bar. Finally, to end all of this alignment, make sure you have a bar, two equal signs, and another bar. Now in practice, each bar is sort of a column space. Each equal sign is again font unit, usually about the width of a W within whatever font. So in this case, start the far left column, come in one, then we have a cloud, space, next column, favorite, space, space, attachment, end column, and then finally tell Twine to stop aligning everything. And as you saw, all of this was underneath. And again, highly recommend checking out the documentation for Harlowe for greater details of how using alignment in different ways. So finally here, we're pulling some code from a previous video on using modals. And we're pulling it pretty much exactly the way it had before. Which is to say, we have a class called modal, and we're using CSS to change things in different ways. And we're using link repeat combined with show macro, which is part of Harlowe 2.0, to show this hook with its name tag, which is initially set to hidden, which is what this parenthesis shows. So we have the modal initially hidden, and then we click on this cloud, which again is just pulling from the previous code, as we saw here in start cloud. It's just this simple element with this class using the word cloud. But I'm also adding that icon thing again. So make sure we're using the class icon for all of this. So it includes the word cloud, which is outside of this usage. For the icon, then we have a break line and the word cloud, and then we have a div, a division element, shown over all of that with a class set to icon, so that when we put the cursor over it, it shows it's a pointer and then sort of informs the user that they can click on it And we have all this modal content going on here, which is reviewed in another video that I linked to here in the previous video in this tutorial series on using dialogues and modals. So we can mimic, as I mentioned, desktop interactions using modals, building on, in this case, in this video, icon usage, where we can show them using one element, add our own styles using additional style rules, this case bigger to, of course, make them bigger, as well as aligning them with some of the markdown that's available as part of Harlowe, and again, check out the documentation for greater detail there, and then, building on the previous video, like I've mentioned, make them modals. In this case, not only including icons, but mimicking desktop functionality. So it looks like an icon, it has a name, and we click on it and action takes place. And we have a modal. And so there's a couple different ways here of using cascading style sheets for icons. Like I said, we can just use them normally. If we wanted some different icons in our story, we can adjust them in size as well as placement using different style rules or using the alignment functionality that exists within Harlowe. And then finally, we can make them act like desktop icons, in a way anyway, by using the show macro, along with the existing functionality that I've demonstrated in other videos of using a modal. So we click on it, it pops up, we close it, click on it, open, close again. So in this way, we can combine different functionality from previous videos, as well as what I've demonstrated here, to do a number of different things for icon usage, using mostly CSS. Other than the modal, it was all primary Twine and CSS to import it, like I showed, and then adjust the rules. And then everything else is sort of reviewed in another video. But primarily, and to use icons with CSS and Twine, it's a matter of just this first line. Just importing the icon family, the font family, from another source. And then if you want, adjusting it in different ways here, making it bigger or smaller, or if you want sort of the icon effects, making sure the cursor is a pointer to indicate to the user they can click on it. So here's different ways of using CSS for icons.